Happy Thursday, and welcome to another episode of Brown Girls Sound Off BGSO, where we center and amplify the voices of women of color. I am joined by my beautiful sisters. Hey, Nafisa. Look at her in her pink and green. She is just gorgeous as always. Hi, Edwina.
Thank
How
you.
are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Hi, Chantal.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good, girl. We rocking the puffs together today. Puff
Yes,
puff girls.
it's a tough kind of week. Yes, indeed.
It is definitely a puff kind of week. Like it's one of those weeks that it's funny because it's Thursday. This week has flown by, but yet it seemed like it's been 2 weeks already, all in one week, right? But
Yeah.
it feels like it's been much longer. But anyway, if you've been following us, and if you haven't, welcome to our podcast. We hope that you enjoy your time with us for the next few minutes or so for our discussion. But if you've been following, you'll know that for the month of December, which I cannot believe we're winding down in December. Where in the world has time gone? But anyway, for the month of December, we've been talking all about women of color rising and leading. So really thinking about 2022 on the horizon. Just different ways of thinking of ourselves individually and collectively, and how we can rise above some of the things that are going on within our community and all around us, and how it is that we're going to be leading the way moving forward. So, today's episode, is one where we're going to be really talking about rising and leading, but in the area of protecting ourselves, right, and other
Hmm.
women. And this is something that I know that we've talked about. This is something that, that's been really circulating in the media, not just social media, but even thinking about the news. Something that's been weighing very, like, extremely heavy on me is the rise in violence against women of color, particularly black women, right? And
Hmm.
so, the past 2 years, 2020, the beginning of the pandemic, as we knew it, right? Who knows when it really started? But 2020 and 2021, have seen drastically higher numbers in terms of murders and other types of violent crimes against black women. And, you know, I read in an article actually recently that Baltimore, which is where we all are based right now,
Hmm.
Baltimore actually recorded its highest number of murders against black women ever.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, it was
Uh,
something about the word ever that
yeah.
I was just like,
Yeah.
it kind of it did something. It did a lot. It did a lot to read that. And I know that, part of the reason why I know that I felt so impacted by reading that is because, for us, we're not statisticians, right? So we're not keeping track of the numbers. I haven't kept track of the numbers. But just as a regular person who, yes, I do, I try to stay abreast of what's happening in my local, and global communities. I've noticed
Hmm.
like this uptick in violence against black women. Like here in our
Yeah.
city, I'm like, oh my gosh, another woman found. Like what is happening with us? So I just want to know. I wanted to talk about this because if you, for those of you who may know, we also have a BGSO group on Facebook. So right, it's the ultimate affinity space full of beautiful, just talented, loving, powerful women of color. And I've been thinking a lot all week about what's happening to us, and especially to us as black women. And I haven't even had the words to even post about it or acknowledge it in the group. Like that's how impacted I've been. Is I have not found the
Hmm.
words at all. And so I just want to know, in terms of what we've been hearing about the violence against black women, and especially like the murders, like when you read those stories or hear the news about it, I want to know, like, how do you feel as a black woman? How does it impact you when you hear about it? And I want to start, with you, Chantal.
The first thing for me is it's heartbreaking. Um, it's heartbreaking and it's scary at the same time. Because as Black women, single, married, whatever your status is, if we are not being protected, like it just leaves you so vulnerable. Like I'm really trying to find the words, because who's protecting us? Who's keeping us safe if we don't even feel safe within our own communities? And it really hits home for me, because I watched my mom go through an abusive relationship growing up, and I've always been that woman that was just like, I'll never let something like that happen to me. I'll always, protect myself and look out for the signs, and you just, you have all of these mindsets. And so for me, it's been constantly triggering. It's been constantly triggering. It's been very, very emotional. And it's been very, very tough to even watch. Because the thought keeps coming to my mind, well, who's protecting us? Who's keeping us safe? So it's a very, very vulnerable place to be in.
Yeah, I hear you, sis. Like, first of all, thank you for sharing, what you witnessed in terms of
Yeah.
your mom. And in that same article that I was reading, y'all know how my mind, I should have actually taken notes on this, but um, there was a person they had interviewed who works with an organization around domestic violence against women. And the person that they interviewed often goes and speaks, not just to audiences, let's say at the college, university, or community level, but even at the funerals of domestic violence victims, right?
Yeah.
And asks, she said that she'll often say, hey, there may be 100 of you out there, 1 to 3 of you, I'm sure, have experienced domestic violence or have had a violent situation that you've been in.
Hmm.
And, I read that and I just thought, like, wow, how powerful, when we start thinking about the numbers, when you start looking around and you're like, well, yeah, even when I look at our group and you just shared, some things that you
Yeah.
saw, and this is a group of 4, right? Um, so, yeah, very triggering, very triggering. Nafisa, what about you? How does it make you feel, when you read about these stories and hear these things as a Black woman?
It's just very disheartening and concerning, and
Hmm.
it's just scary. I mean, I know, I suffer and I deal with anxiety. So it just a lot of that, it triggers that within me. I'm already like extra like anxious about certain things. So when things like that come up, like I'm like overly thinking it. You know what I mean? Like if I am coming home by myself and I'm not with my husband, I'm like looking all around. Even though you should do that anyway, I'm like it's like has my anxiety like through the roof. Like at certain times where I don't feel like I'm where I feel like I guess I'm more vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
if I'm like by myself or it's just me and my daughter and it's at nighttime. So it's very, very scary, very, very concerning. And it's sad. It's very sad, especially when it starts to trickle down and you're seeing it happening to children.
Mm-hmm.
It was a 13-year-old, I heard like a 3-year-old, that's those things are very, and having a child of my own, all of this thing is just very, very triggering and scary. And, it is definitely, affecting, my anxiety where I have to just kind of keep it together and keep myself grounded, try to stay away from the news and different things I can do to kind of, help myself, to be able to continue and do my daily, things without having the anxiety like consume me. So yeah, it's very, very it's scary and very triggering and sad.
Yeah. It is, and I'm glad that what you brought up, sis, was the fact that honestly there seems to have been an uptick in violence against Black women and girls, right? And that's a whole deeper conversation. We've sort of talked about this episodes ago. It might have even been first season when we talked about like the adultification of Black girls in particular, right? And so a lot of our Black girls are even increasingly becoming victims of gun violence and other types of violence and abuse. And it's sad is just like an understatement. I mean, I can't even I don't even know, for those of you who are watching, type in the comments if you've also, noticed some of these things happening more frequently, and how it's made you feel, whether you identify as a Black woman or not. How has it made you feel just kind of looking at these statistics around the violence against Black women, and particularly the murder of Black women. Edwina, what are your thoughts? How are you feeling?
Um, I think anxiety is probably one of the ones too, that it does kind of raise that anxiety level for sure. Having been someone who, not a victim of gun violence or whatsoever, but having been robbed in front of my home. And so ever since that triggering or event that happened, I've been very vigilant. And it's every time I see something like that or I hear something like that, I think about that. And it's very scary, especially being a single woman and a mother. And so I'm, like Nafisa say, I am like always on 10, watching my surroundings, locking my doors, like running into my car. So it definitely does heighten that sense of, I guess, awareness that I didn't really have before. But another thing that I just realized that I find to be very disheartening is the fact that most of the violence that I'm hearing is coming from relationship, like people that either there was a breakup or it's somebody in your family or a neighbor, or and so that's also like the very scary part of it, is that the violence is not really coming from the outside. These are like your immediate family or immediate relationships that you've had, and that is drawing that anxiety, because you just never know when people are going to snap. You never know, like, when is that breaking point. You never know, like, what's going to take someone to that next level of violence, and it can happen so instant that it does kind of make you become mindful, like, well, you just never know, like, you like you start to think about the people in which you keep around you, and start to be a little bit more vigilant in that way, which we shouldn't be, but that's unfortunately what's been happening. It is coming from within the home, unfortunately. So yeah, it's a scary time, and it does raises that heightened fear that we shouldn't have.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, sis, that you say that, because just today, I was driving and I was just thinking, like, I'm scared to get out there and date. You know what I mean? It got me like nervous about meeting new people. I was like,
Yeah,
because if the people, like you said, I'm thinking about recent incidents of violence. You're absolutely right. They've all been domestic. The ones that have made the, like big headlines that I know that I'm kind of holding on to in my heart right now in our area. But they've all been, domestic related. They've all been centered around children and current or former spouses or lovers or romantic partners, and that is the really really scary part. And the other thing that, and this is a much longer episode or conversation, the other thing that's really scary is, in at least two of the incidents that I know I've recently read about, the women, they actually sought help or protection, right, from the legal system, and were denied, protective orders and things of that nature. And you know, I'm not a expert in that field, but one can't help but think or wonder if it would have made a difference had they had some sort of legal protection. Or, I'm not saying that it would have, but I mean, it just, I don't know. That's the other disheartening part, was to know that in at least two of these cases that I'm thinking of, like, these women saw it coming. They wrote about, like, I fear for my life. This person has threatened my life, and it's so brave and courageous of them, because one of the things that I actually read about in one of the articles that I read was the fact that Black women are actually less likely to seek help when in abusive relationships. And so, like, I just kind of want to know from you all, what do you think, like, why the silence in our community? Why are we less likely to seek help in violent and harmful and unhealthy relationships, yet I believe it was 2.5 times greater we had a 2.5 times greater chance of being harmed by gun violence than white women as black women. So when I saw that, I'm like, well, it seems like the numbers are stacked against us here. So why the silence? And Nafisa, what are you thinking? Why the silence in our community when it comes to being in abusive relationships?
I just think just the fear of being, judged, and I think that's the main thing, just fear of being judged, and what are people going to think? What are people going to say? Are people going to think I'm stupid? Like, well, why haven't you been said something? I think just the whole thought process of just think of fear of judgment, opposed to the person just trying to be there for you and support you and to help you. I think it's really the fear of judgment. And I think also sometimes it may be a fear of how the other person may take it, you know. They may be like, okay, well, I want it to stop, but I don't want them to like kill him. You know what I mean? So I think it's like a fine line of that too. Cause I know like some of my family members, like not to, I'm not in that situation, but you just food I would call it, that would be the case. You know what I mean? So I think that, I mean, straight up. So I think it's partially both of those things, but I think a big part of it is just the fear of just being judged, and they're embarrassed when they should.
Yeah, when they shouldn't be, right? We
Um,
should feel comfortable reaching out for help because it can be a matter of life or death. And we
life
know
or
life or death, sis. And we know. What do you think? Why the silence in our community?
Well, I automatically just felt like there are some times where we do speak out and the lack of support. Um, like people just kind of brushing it over. Oh, girl, you gonna be all right. Like it's not that serious. Or like if going to if you don't see it being a trend where I can go and seek help with a police officer or whatsoever. Um, because we just don't like we don't see a lot of support in that way, and so it does become a thing where, well, they're not going to help me anyway if I was to go and report this case, and so I'm just not going to do it. So whether it's coming from a lack of support within your community or lack of support from what we call it from the system, I guess. And it just feel like and that's not even just from like a violence standpoint. It comes from like our health standpoint, from doctors, and it comes from, so it's like different avenues of when we're seeking help, and that feeling of not being heard and not being taken seriously, that can then draw you in, and you just keep things to yourself. And I've been a victim of that, where I did go and I said something out loud, like this is what's happening to me, and nothing was done, and I didn't hear anything else about it. So then what did I do? I stopped talking. I was like, well, I'm just going to keep it to myself. And so I think that most of the time that's what's happening with women that just don't speak out.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, and it makes sense, right? If like I said, we're looking at instances where women are saying, "Hey, this is what was said to me. Here's the evidence, that I have. This person is threatened to kill me." And yet they're not granted, a protection order or something, like how does that not happen? You know what I mean? And so I can see how that can make people feel, that can make us feel as black women, like, well, why reach out in the first place, right? If folks aren't going to believe me or take my fear seriously. Chantal, what do you think? Why the silence in our community?
Well, one of the things I often see, especially with this new generation of young folk, is how we have embraced this sort of toxic culture around abuse. I mean, you see these videos and TikToks and of people fighting, and I think there was one where the girlfriend was actually beating up on the guy. And so I'm highlighting that because of how many millions of views it got and all of the commentary. And you heard more laughter and kiki ha ha than that's not right. We need to address this. And so it's just really scary how we've created in our own culture this toxic acceptance,
Mm.
you know. of abuse in general, right? That we really need to sort of be having more conversation. And even in domestic violence situations, you have a lot of people in the community who will tell you, oh, it's not that bad. Oh, they downplay it, especially if you grew up in generationally, things were swept under the rug. You didn't talk about certain things. And so we have to really keep having this conversation and bringing it to the forefront, because we need to be out there, all of us as Black and brown women, saying, no, this is not okay. And we need to continually say these types of videos should not be allowed to be seen and cast all over the world and be made fun of, because this is a very serious matter, very serious situations that's happening within our community. And so for me, it really is utilizing the tools that we have within our community to continue to have this conversation, especially, amongst ourselves, because if the system's not going to protect us, we have to protect ourselves by any means necessary, and check on your sis, when you're having that conversation and she's out there dating, check in with her. Hey, how's it going? Do you feel safe with him? Is there any red flags? Is there anything that's bothering you're concerned about, and take it seriously, and so for me, it's really about continuing to have this conversation.
No, I love that. You actually led really nicely into, I guess how I want to, wrap this conversation up in terms of how is it that we support one another, and protect ourselves. I think that you brought up some really great points about, us normalizing having conversations about our relationships too. Because I feel, and obviously you can't speak for all Black women, but the way that I grew up, I didn't really hear people talking about their relationships. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Like I didn't hear, like
Mm-hmm.
that wasn't like a regular part of conversation that I heard. And yes, I get it. Like there's a thin line. You don't want to openly talk about everything that's going on in your marriage and everything. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is I know for a fact that many of them were dysfunctional. You know what I mean? That there was some stuff
Yeah.
happening and that people needed help. And yet, no,
Right.
I didn't see people seeking help. Like
Right.
that just wasn't something that was like normalized. And then on the same token, and if you follow BGSO, you know that yes, it is, especially within our group, our Facebook group, it is the ultimate affinity space for women of color. But we don't, engage in male bashing and finger pointing. And I want to make this point. One thing that I'm noticing is what feels to me like an uptick in violence against Black women perpetuated by Black men, right? And so from my own experience, one thing that I also want to see more of is Black men talking about their relationships and giving
Absolutely.
each other
Mm-hmm.
and really the same way like we found like our sister circle, and like we, how we do, we talk about everything, and we give it advice, we affirm one another, and all that, we ask questions and da 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 da. I want to see more men doing that, so that way, speaking of toxic, so that toxic masculinity isn't perpetuated, such that, Black men think, oh, we don't talk about that kind of stuff. Like, we just going, sit around, and do whatever. Like, no. Like, let's normalize it being the manly thing to do, the masculine thing to do, to actually open up and talk about what you're feeling in your relationship and maybe some of the thoughts that you're having, and, and things like that, and asking for support from your brothers. I mean, that's one thing that I'd like to see more of. And yes, it is happening in many spaces. I'm just going to say, just from my experience, there are a lot of spaces where it's still just not happening. And I think that creates this gap, this divide, between us. Edwina and Nafisa, what do you all think about this? How do we support one another, protect each other and ourselves?
Yeah, I think what you guys said, having a line of communication, especially for those, your girlfriends, your relatives, or whatsoever, and being able to just listen. And when you do hear a red flag, that is something that you can, go and ask questions, and like you were saying, like, is everything okay? You said this, and I was just, and it sounded a little concerning to me. Do you need help? Can I support you in this area? And so just those around you know that you are a person that they can talk to, and that if something is wrong, like I know I can depend on her. Like if something is a red flag, that this is a person that I can come to, and I feel safe talking to this person, for whatever support can come out of this. I think just being that safe space for our friends and our loved ones is a way that we can start it. And I think protecting ourselves is just being, vigilant. Like I'm already on 10. Like I said, I know I don't go anywhere. I go in my car, I lock my door before I even take off. And I think just, being aware of your surroundings at all times, and being aware of, a lot of us, well, most of us are single in this group. And like you said, protecting ourselves. And even in that, whenever we're meeting someone for the first time, being aware, like maybe sharing that with someone else, so someone else is aware that I am going to meet this person, or I met this person. This is so that somebody else knows the plan, and we're not just leaving ourselves out there and putting ourselves in really in situations that could turn out to be something else. So I think those would be my two things.
And not ignoring those red flags, right? Because
Yeah.
in some of these, I'll just speak from our perspective actually on this. In my experience, I have ignored red flags that I should not have ignored, right? And things can escalate really quickly, and not because it came out of nowhere, right? And not because it just was like, oh my gosh, this person would not, because a lot of the comments that I'm reading in a lot of these stories, people are like, oh my gosh, I never knew. But 9.9 times out of 10, that woman knew. You know what I mean? Like there were signs. And so that's one thing that I know that I'm taking into the future with me, is just like not ignoring things, because there are many ways in which violence arises in relationships. It doesn't just start in the physical, right? Words can be violence too, right? So when people are showing, heightened levels of like aggression and things like that, and it goes 0 to 100, we got to be cognizant of that and be like, if they can go from here to here like that with their words, then how else can this quickly escalate? You know what I mean? I don't know. Nafisa, did you have any final thoughts as we wrap up this conversation?
I think we pretty much covered everything. The only thing I wanted to add is just to for anyone who is in a situation that they don't feel safe and they don't feel protected, and they've done that protective order, they've done things from the legal aspect, and they're still not feeling safe in that matter, to really reach out to friends and family, and not to be ashamed, like to let them know, like, the police, I've done whatever, I don't feel safe, I feel like this is what's happening, like to really, really communicate that to like your friends, your family, and let them know to be vocal about that and to not be embarrassed at all.
Thank you. That was a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for wrapping up that conversation in that way. Thank you all for listening in. This is a conversation that is, we've used words like triggering and things like that because it really is for us. And so, if you have experienced any of these things, if you wish to and feel comfortable with sharing, maybe how, any tips that you've used to get yourself out of these situations, or if you're in, a professional field where you deal with this on a daily basis, you have resources to share, please drop it in the comments, whether on YouTube or even if you're watching in the BGSO group, because according to the statistics, chances are someone or some people in our group are dealing with this. Some of you who are watching out on YouTube are dealing or have dealt with instances of violence, but it must stop. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please tune in for our episode next week, which I can't believe again will be the end of season 2 for us. Oh my gosh, 2 seasons. So next week will be our final episode. We hope to see you there. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your evening. Bye, everyone.